Okay, let's try the next step. This will be the equivalent of Chapter 4 in your textbook with much enhancement. Commercial operations. We're going to cover commercial stations, non-commercial stations, uh, programming, and audience measurement in this section. It's just going to go right down the list. First of all, in stations, you have different types of primarily television stations, but they also radio as well. You have O and O's, you have affiliates, and you have independents. Well, O and O's, these are commercial stations. O and O's are owned and operated by the networks. They're allowed to own a set number. They can't exceed more than 30% of the population. 1/3 of the population, 33%. But they can own as many stations as they want, as long as they don't reach more than 1/3 of the population. Any owner can do that. So the stations they own are called O and O's, owned and operated. This is where they get all the revenue. So these are their cash cows when it comes to television broadcasting. Then you have independents, which are stations that do not have any connection to a network, or maybe they might take individual programming, but they don't take all the programming. So that would be independents. And then kind of in the middle, you have affiliates. These are stations that have different ownership. They're not owned by the networks, but they have a contractual arrangement to take the programming from the networks. These would be your affiliates. So you have O and O's that are fully owned by the networks. You have affiliates that have a relationship with the networks. And then you have independents who go to other sources to get their own programming. Next up, you have the term network compensation. Well, this relates to affiliates. Networks will pay affiliates in certain prize markets, say New York, Chicago, whatever, a certain amount of money to have their programming on these large stations. Now, not every affiliate gets network compensation. Honestly, when I was a FamilyNet affiliate, we didn't get paid by FamilyNet. We were just glad to have programming. So that's a beneficial relationship, even though we weren't paid. But in larger markets, plum markets, like I said, top 10, I would think, it's those markets are so desirable to the networks that they're willing to pay to compensate a local station for their airtime to carry their programming and their advertising, the network advertising. So, in a nutshell, network compensation is money paid by the network to the local broadcast station, the local affiliate. Clearance. Clearance is when stations give passage clearance and carry the network programs, it's called clearance. They give clearance for the network programming to go through on their station. So that's when this, again, station allows the network programming to be played, broadcast. Head end, we've already discussed that for cable. Per subscriber fee, that's just the fees that make the primary revenue for cable stations, cable systems. It's the subscribers who will pay to have cable. And the same is true with satellite distribution. That's where they make a lot of their money. Avails, this would be the spots, how many spots you have that you can sell for advertising. That's, in the sense, it makes up the inventory that a television station has to sell. It's a sales term. Cooperative advertising. Okay, this is where a national advertiser teams up with a local vendor, a local store, let's say, and they share the advertising cost. For example, back when I ran this back at the station in Alabama, we had a local business that wanted to advertise their location for our football package. Well, they had a national company that they sold for. This in case it was Wolverine Boots. So Wolverine Boots paid for half the advertising, and they sent us a nice professionally done ad. And then we coupled that with the local store's video tag, a shot of their store, and did a voiceover, and the Wolverine Boots available at so-and-so downtown in Coleman. So each part paid half of the advertising cost. and that's called cooperative advertising. Now, one thing about cooperative advertising, that's one of the places where you need to have what we call a POP, or a proof of performance. This is a legal document. It's a listing of all the places their ads aired. You get it notarized and you sign it. I would have to do this as the general manager of the station. So that's what a POP is. It's a proof of performance. Now we also talk about different types of sales: national sales, local sales, etc. Network sales, first of all. Network sales are sales that happen through the network. And local station just carries the ads. National sales are sales where it's not through a network, it's bought directly from the station, but it's for a national advertiser. And then in that case, you would have a national representative. A national rep is what it's called. We worked with Blair, for example, when I was at WDSU in New Orleans. What the national advertiser does, the national rep does, is they have a relationship with stations all over the world, all over the country. So let's say a snowmobile company wants to advertise in markets all over. Well, instead of going to individual television stations in each of the individual markets, they would go to the national rep, who will say, hey, we want to sell in Wisconsin, in Illinois, in New England area. We also want to hit the western states, northern western states. Get us some buys in that area. Okay, and then the national rep will contact all of its stations in that area and say, hey, we've got this potential buy by this snowmobile company. What do you have available? And then each of the stations will send back to the national rep where we have spots. And then the national rep says, okay, this is where you can place. And then the advertiser goes, okay, I want to be here, 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 here. Make the buy. And then the national rep makes the buy at the local TV stations. And but those TV stations are in areas where people would use snowmobiles. It wouldn't do good. It would be useless to advertise in New Orleans because we don't get enough snow barely to make a snowman. So this national sales allow you to target specific markets on a national basis. And you have one person doing it for you as your rep, rather than having to go talk to all of the individual stations one-on-one. That would be national sales. Local sales, that means selling television time, radio time in the local market to local advertisers. We've already discussed proof of performance, ratings. Ratings are the percentage of the total viewing or listening audience. Not necessarily all the people who are listening or viewing at that time, but all the people who can, based on the number of television households or the size of the audience for radio. Shares, on the other hand, are the percentage of the people who are actually using that media at that time. In television, we call it the houses using television, the HUT level, as opposed to TV households, which is the whole market. Okay, so how do you know how many people are watching? You take the rating, which is a percentage, and you multiply it times the number of TV households, and that will tell you how many are actually watching the show at any given time. What all the ratings add up to? They equal the HUT level, and the shares will always add up to 100. Let me see what else. CPM, cost per thousand. Okay, remember I told you about the rating. Again, you take the rating, multiply it times the total TV households. That'll give you, let's say, 20,000. Okay, and then let's say it's an ad that costs 300. Okay, so you take the 300 and you divide it by 20. What do you get? $15 per thousand. You get me? 20, and then you put the 300, and then you divide the 300 by 20, the number of thousands, and that will give you 15. And so it's $15 is the cost per thousand. Trade out or barter. That's when you take from a vendor, you receive some good or services. Let's say whenever we used to produce football, Chick-fil-A would provide the meals for the crew. We wouldn't pay them cash. Instead, we would say, and the crew tonight is fed by Chick-fil-A, and we give them advertising in the football game as a sponsor. And that's how they paid for their sponsorship. We would also have other relationships where We had a furniture company that provided for our set furniture, things like that. Instead of actually there being an exchange of cash, because cash can be hard to come by. Some advertisers don't have, a lot of money extra for their budget, but they can cut loose a little bit of inventory much more easily, and this way the station doesn't have to go out and buy stuff. They can just use the barter. Um, what else? Barter, viral marketing. That's when, um, on the internet, instead of going in direct advertising and buying time, something goes out on the air, maybe a funny commercial, and you share it. And the person you share it shares it with other people, etc., because it's such a fun ad, and then it goes viral. It's depending on kind of a word of mouth thing, uh, by engaging with a funny video or something like that. Paola. Okay, Paola. This goes back to the days when radio started really carrying a lot of records, as opposed to having live orchestras. Well, the record industry realized, hey, the more airplay a song gets, the more people buy the record. So they started paying off DJs to repeat the broadcast again and again of their song to give it extra airplay to drive up the record sales. Well, that's illegal. You can't bribe, you're not supposed to bribe a company, a radio station, especially because this is where it took place a lot, to carry your song because, well, you can't bribe the individual. This would be paid for DJs, kind of under the counter. So yeah, payola is illegal. If somebody receives a financial benefit from doing something on the air broadcasting, it needs to be disclosed to the ownership of the station. Um, Clipping, that's when stations that are network affiliates will cut out or cut to commercial breaks early in the program to put their own ads in so they can get a little bit of ad time, or even cut out the network advertising. It's fraud, basically. You're saying we're carrying your ads, but then you're clipping them out. So that's illegal. Multicasting, that's when you have multiple distribution, you have distribution of multiple television signals, channels, if you will, through one channel. For example, in the old days, analog television, Channel 4 had only Channel 4. Now you can watch Channel 4.1, Channel 4.2. Channel 7, I think, has 3. Has the HD and then 2 SD. So those would be multicasting, using the same bandwidth as had only when they only had carried one station before. Underwriting. Okay, this is basically funding or sponsoring something. This really comes into play with non-commercial broadcasting, which we'll talk about in a minute. We use underwriting for WNGR. We cannot sell advertising, but we can get sponsors to underwrite programming in general or specific programming, let's say athletic events or something like that. Narrowcasting. Okay, remember when we talked about in the beginning of radio, it was big audience. It was for everybody in the household. Well, whenever television came along, it lost that big audience appeal. So they learned to focus on targeted audiences within the market. Young people, older people, men, women, based on a particular demographic or lifestyle. And so they target that group and they bring advertisers to those more specific potential buyers. So it's narrowcasting, format-based niche advertising. TVHH is television households. LOP, least objectionable programming. In the older days of television broadcasting, before the use of the remote, or now, with the capability of just you choose what you want off of boy, I'm getting a hard glare on my head. Instead, what you do is the programming was designed for let's just not chase them away. So you tended to have maybe a blander, more broad appeal, not really edgy. If people liked something, everybody else did it because they were trying to get that programming. And again, as long as it's not so bad that somebody leaves, we're doing okay. Nowadays, with so many different venues for getting your television program, it's becoming more and more, how should I say, yeah, we're being pushed to produce more quality because people have alternatives if they want to see what we're showing. So, uh, yeah, least objectionable programming is a concept that goes back to you don't want to chase away your audience. But now it's more and more you have to draw your audience in. So it's becoming more competitive. Hut level, I've already mentioned, houses using television. Now let's move over to commercial operations. Let me go ahead and move my mouse up here so I can see what's up next. Just a few terms here. Understand the reserve channel principle. That goes back to, was really codified, if you will, in the sixth report and order, where certain stations were dedicated and set aside, reserved for educational television. After the debacle in radio about having educational radio stations, and people would buy out, and commercial ventures would buy them out and say, "Oh, we'll give you money for your license." Um, they came to realize that no, we need to set certain channels apart in television, and that's what the reserve channel principle is. There are certain channels in the market that are dedicated for non-commercial broadcasting, and if they're used up, then you can't get your non-commercial license. You have to go for a commercial broadcast license. Carnegie Foundation, one of the early funders of public television. Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. Basically, Congress finally stepped up and said, okay, we need to have a codified legal structure within to move forward with non-commercial broadcasting, primarily educational television. And so the Public Broadcasting Act basically set up the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Now, CPB doesn't work by producing programs necessarily. Rather, the network takes in programming from stations all within the PBS and sends them out. Now, you may have independent production houses such as Children's Television Workshop that produce Sesame Street, but the programming comes from either these independents or from member stations. The PBS does not produce programming itself. National Public Radio is one of those outlets. It's their network. And CPB qualified means not every non-commercial station can be part of the PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. They have to meet certain requirements, technical requirements, staffing requirements, etc. Underwriting, I've already mentioned. BBC Television is just another, is one of the programming sources that people will go to. That's where I get my Doctor Who, and those of you who are crazy Monty Python fans, other programming, Masterpiece Theatre. These would be some of the programs that would come from BBC, just as another programming resource. And finally, the Children's Television Workshop, which I've mentioned before. This was a neat idea, and they really took, honestly, I remember watching it. Children's educational television was blah. And Children's Television Workshop really worked to develop, kind of set the standard in a way with Sesame Street of what is effective educational children's television. At this time, like I told you, Zoom came out, the electric company. I was too old for Sesame Street and didn't really get into the electric company, but Zoom, man, Zoom was good. I was inspired by Zoom. Right, Zoom, ZOOM, Box 350, Boston, Mass. 02134. Anyway, send it to Zoom. Programming. This really goes into the next section for operations, and that is programming. Remember our big four. We're dealing with economics, how do we pay for it at this point, and programming, which is why people will tune into your medium. Programming may be television shows, radio shows, but with this, or with the computer like we're watching right here, this thing. Okay, apps, programs, resources that are available on the internet. Programming is what draws people into your technology. So, first of all, a few concepts we need to talk about here. Uh, that would be segmentation. Segmentation, this goes back to the idea of formatting or niche marketing. The audience, instead of trying to hit the broad audience, you're looking for specific parts of that audience. This is where demographics come into play. I'm trying to target, let's say, women from age 18 to 35, because I'm selling products that would be useful around with helping with taking care of children. Or maybe I'm trying to target men who are 22 and older. So I may go to a football game. Although actually the audience for football is both male and female, and it's growing. Um, who do you want to sell cars to? Well, generally in the family, if you're talking about a family car, you target women because they're the ones who generally have the final say. Sorry, guys. And what car is going to be purchased by the family. But if you're going to be selling something that may have a more masculine appeal, you might look for a show or a radio station that targets more to a male audience. This would be the segmentation. If you're trying to sell golf clubs, the Golf Channel, yeah, that's a segmented audience. So the when I watch BBC and I'm watching Masterpiece Theatre, uh, the Viking Cruise Lines are big supporters, underwriters for Masterpiece Theater. Why? Because they figure it's us elite types who are watching such distinguished programs who might be their potential customers. So anyway, that would be the idea of segmentation of the audience. Don't worry about 80-20 principle. Channel repertoire. Okay, how many of y'all got cable? Like with 200 channels, and how many do you actually watch? When you get on the internet, how many websites do you on a regular basis regularly go to? 5, maybe 10. Okay, that's your repertoire. In television, they really got to see that people really only have maybe 4 or 5, 6 maybe channels that they watch, even though cable is offering 200, or the same with satellite. So that's kind of a realistic approach. It used to be, oh, you can get cable, you can get 200 channels. If it's 200 channels of junk, why do I want cable? They are looking at experimenting with sort of a la carte buying on cable instead of having to buy tiers where you add another 50 channels. I'd rather just buy the local and maybe 3 networks. So instead of paying all this money for the stuff I'm not using, lower my price and let me pick up specific channels. Day parts. Okay, day parts. Different parts of the day, amazingly, have different types of audiences and different sizes of audience. For radio, big day part, morning drive. And then it kind of tapers off during the day. Another big pickup with radio is evening drive. People headed home. Why? Because they're in their cars and they listen to radio. Then it tapers off into the evening. But television, because people are now at home, prime time is, depending on your time zone, begins at 6 or 7 o'clock or 8. Network prime time comes in at 8 o'clock here in the Eastern time zone, for example, and it runs till 11 o'clock. And that's when the major audiences are sitting down watching television. And that's where advertisers are willing to pay big bucks. Off-network syndication. Okay, and by the day parts, I show it in the PowerPoint that's in that section. Okay, off-network syndication. Okay, syndication. Let me explain network programming, syndication, and off-network syndication. A few terms are going to come into play here, but I want you to see the group together. Networks produce programming, and they broadcast it, and it's carried by the local station, the affiliate. Now, after the networks run the program for, let's say, a couple of years, you get enough in the can, as they say, the old film can is what they're talking about. And you get enough in the can, and then you can sell it into syndication. Now, the networks don't sell the programming. The producers, the independent producers who have had a contract with the networks, will now go into syndication and make their money there. The networks don't pay that well for the first year or two until it takes off and they see they're going to be making more money with the advertising. And the producers don't really make a whole lot of money until the show gets into syndication out of the first couple of years. Now, after that happens, the networks know they have a hot item, then the price the networks are willing to pay can go up, and they're also making money in syndication. But for the beginning, it's looked at as deficit financing. I mean, they may make just enough money to cover costs, or even not enough to do that, until again they can get prepped to go into syndication. So when a show has been on the network, has built up an audience, has built up a reputation and expectations, then when it goes into syndication, it's called off network because it's no longer on the network. Off network syndication. MASH. If you watch reruns of like NCIS or CSI and all these shows that were carried on one of the big four, excuse me, ABC, CBS, NBC, or Fox, and now it's on maybe a show on Lifetime or there's a show on whatever network that would be more of a cable network. That's off-network syndication. It was originally produced for the network, and now it's not. Sometimes you have what is called first-run syndication. These shows were never intended for the networks. They were intended for direct sell into syndication. And by the way, this is where your independent TV stations get their programming from. They will go off-network syndication. I've seen MASH 5 or 6 times in the same day, because one person bought seasons 1 and 2, another station bought seasons 3 and 4, another station bought 5 and 6, and then you have another with the next 2, and then you have the nighttime primetime show of the most recent MASH episodes. I kid you not. It would be on several times in a day back when I was in college. Okay, audience flow. This is when audience stays through one show, flows into the next, and that's what you want. Stripping. Okay, whenever a show, that's the target for a network show, to have enough shows in the can, as I said, so they can strip it. They can put it especially like short sitcoms and things like that, 30-minute shows, run them Monday through Friday, let's say mid-afternoon, for the at-home audience, or in the primetime access window, which is before the networks programming can be carried. Lead in, that's when you have a strong show at the beginning of a set of shows, let's say. For example, NCIS is still one of the hottest dramas on CBS, so they put it at 8 o'clock, and that draws in an audience, and that audience may flow through to the next show at 9 o'clock. Which is similar, called block programming when you do that, with NCIS New Orleans. And so people who might watch this will stay through to watch this, and then another sort of action police show to follow. That would be block programming, but you're also depending on a strong lead from the first show at 8 o'clock to flow through. Hot switching is whenever you have a show, and let's say as the end of NCIS starts to come, and then as it's going, they hit right into the next show immediately, even without a commercial break. Why? To get you to get hooked on the next show coming up. Then they run the intro and the commercial break in the intro and getting to the show proper. That would be hot switching. All kind of tricks to get people to stay with the programming. Counter programming. Is okay. I jumped. Let me go back. Okay, sorry, I glanced up and got out of order on my list. Counter programming is whenever you run a program that is different from what's on by your competitor. So let's say your competitor is carrying Monday Night Football. Well, if you try to broadcast another football game, you might have a diluted audience because you're going for the same audience. But when you counter program, let's say you might put on you might lead off with the first part with a couple of sitcoms that are very strong. Why? You're not going after the football audience. You're not going to get them. It's the NFL, But you might be able to find everybody else who's so sick and tired of football. Oh, wow, I can watch this. And then they'll watch the sitcoms, and then they'll stay with that show as long as it's strong enough to hold their attention. Again, these theories work okay, but now with the democratization of the media, remember that term? You choose your own programming. If I don't like the football game, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to Netflix. If I don't like what's on broadcast. So some of these programming strategies are kind of weakening. But we still have appointment television, which is another term. Appointment television is our appointment television or programming is when you're broadcasting, especially a live event, and people adjust their schedules to see it, so they participate in it live. Now, there are some shows that will have a strong following, and people will adjust their schedules so that they can watch that show. But it's not like the old days when that was the only way you could see it. When it came on at 7 o'clock in the evening on Friday, well, you adjusted your schedule. People, when Dallas was big back in the early '80s, people stayed home on Saturday nights to watch JR. Scary thought. But nowadays, I just watch it on Netflix, or I'll watch it on uh, 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 IPTV, Internet Protocol Television. I just watch it off the CBS's website instead of watching it off their broadcast. So again, some of these programming strategies are useful to understand the thinking, but now people are making their own programming schedules basically through democratization. And other things, stunting is where they will change the schedule around. Let's say I'm uh, I'm CBS and I have my schedule laid out, and we're getting ready to go into the sweeps period where they take ratings, and then the A guy at ABC goes, "Hey, they've got instead of my normal schedule, I'm going to run a blockbuster movie on Monday night, and because it was very popular and people won't watch." They won't watch my channel because they're going to go over here to watch the blockbuster movie. So that would be stunting. Tentpole, put a strong show in the middle. It'll draw people in earlier to watch, and maybe they'll start watching it more and more. And it also give lead to the strong for a newer program perhaps that will follow. An example of how this worked: when we would sit, our Sunday evening ritual is after church. We'd come home, turn on the TV for Masterpiece. Yes, I am one of those. Mainly Masterpiece Mystery. That's what we like to watch. And so we would tune in, and there was this British baking show, and the characters were so much fun. My wife she started tuning in at 8:30 instead of 9 o'clock to watch the British baking show. So that would be an example of how a follow theory works. You have a strong show here, but people tuning in early may tune in much earlier to watch that show. Appointment television, flow through, we have expressed. A format or a hot clock. Okay, what is that? That's in radio. It's like a clock, and you say, okay, from the top of the hour down to here, we may have this kind of music, then a break, and it's just a kind of a grid, but in a clock form that shows you the kind of programming you're going to be conducting throughout that hour. Now, you may have a hot clock for the morning, you have a different hot clock in the afternoon, a different hot clock for the evening drive. Um, it just depends on how programming has arranged it. I know that when I would fill in the morning at WORD, they would have one clock for the first hour, and then when we got into drive time, we had a different clock because we had to add traffic, and then in the last hour, it was past after drive, so it would shift to a different clock. So it's not fixed for every hour every day. You have a hot clock. You can adjust it based on the day part that you're in. Deficit financing, I've already mentioned that. That was with how the networks don't pay as much, and independent producers, have to swallow some cost until they can get their show in syndication. So why do they go to the networks? Because the networks give them a platform. The networks promote the programming to get the audiences. So, it's helpful for both people. All news format, just something that started with CNN back in the '80s. And it's an approach to countering the broad audience appeal of television with a more of a niche approach. The niche approach to television, like it happened to radio. When radio was there, big audience, television comes in, radio goes niche. Well, when cable came in and so many different channels started coming in, television had to look at its niches. So one of the early experiments was all news. Who's going to watch news all day long? Well, they had an audience. In fact, the nice thing about CNN was you could, if you want to know what was happening, you turn it on CNN, watch for 15 minutes, you get the rundown of the day, then you go on your business instead of having to wait until 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock to watch the national, or 5:30 or 6:30 to watch the national news. Let's see, reality programming, just an early, a more recent experiment in using non-professional actors to make programming. It's less expensive, but it became a popular format, kind of like watching what people like you did and how they got themselves in trouble. Local programming, stuff produced by the local broadcaster, whether that's television or radio. Syndicated programming, I've already explained to you, that's programming that is in syndication. It could be off-network syndication or first-run syndication. Network programming, I've explained. Okay, NAPTE, N-A-P-T-E, and I see podcasting is right next to it. That's two different terms. Sorry about that. NAPTE is basically where they come together for a national convention. I don't remember exactly what NAPTE means, but it's the big national convention where producers come and show their programming for people to buy for carrying on their television stations. So that's where the producers who had now what is now off-network syndicated programming, as well as first-run syndication, as well as movie packages and all that, they'll come and show their wares and try to hype up attention and get stations to buy, and for that matter, networks to come and buy their programming. And also, this is also where producers will sell to the networks and try to get the networks to pick up their show. Blogcast, you know what that is. Audience promotion. This is part of, excuse me, where you promote to your audience, you promote your station so that more people will watch. B&Rs, brand management, just basically trying to control how people see your brand, see your product. B&Rs, video news releases. These are basically kind of like pseudo news. You get what can become pseudo news, or it's agenda-driven news. There's a major problem, major health issue affecting Americans today. Blah 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 blah, and my drugs will help solve that problem. That's a video news release. It comes off like science, but it's really just a platform to sell a product. Part of the criticism is that instead of doing actual news reporting, sometimes news outlets will use VNRs, and because it's cheap and it fills up time, feeds the programming monster. Pseudo events are events that are staged for the simple purpose of getting news coverage. It's one thing, where somebody says, I'm going to call a press conference. And they call a press conference with no real news. They just call it so that the news people will show up and then have pictures. Politicians do this. People who have a cause may stage an event just so they can get the news cameras there to cover the event, not really doing much else. Finally, the last section in this discussion will be about audience measurement. Briefly, how do you know how many people are watching? Remember, the goal of sales is to sell eyeballs and ears. So how do you know how many eyeballs and ears you have? In digital, we know how many people click in, click through. But in television, we have to do more, and radio, we have to do more of a sampling. People who do this are Arbitron and Nielsen. Arbitron for radio, and although if I remember correctly, Nielsen is actually moving into the radio business as well. They will use a technology, people meters, where people log in what they're watching. Technically, sometimes they'll use diaries. There was the old Nielsen family where you have a log book, and everybody has their pages, and they write down what they want, what they watch. Another way of getting the information is through what is called a coincidental telephone interview is when they call in and they say, "What are you watching right now?" And what are you listening to on the radio? And that's the way they get the samples of the audience. Um, and sometimes they'll do where they do recall. They say, "What did you watch last night? What did you listen to on the way home?" Or way home on the as you were driving in, and that's why it's very important for people, for stations to make sure they have good branding, frequently saying, "You're listening to the Vibe, WNGR." Or a different kind of college radio. Why do we say that all the time? Well, if nothing else, we want the people who listen to us, we want the radio station to be first one in their mind. So then if somebody says, uh, what station do you listen to? Well, what station were you listening to? The Vibe. Okay, good. It's catchy. It gets our name out, our identity out. And other stations are doing this too. Because recall, they may not remember what station they were listening to or watching last night, but they will say the first station that comes to mind. Uh, Valerie Geller has said that it's statistically proven that the more a station tells the audience who they are, the more their ratings go up because the more people actually remember them. Random sample. Okay, this is a biggie. This is what ratings are based on. They can't question the entire audience, and that would be cost prohibitive. So instead, they take a random sample, meaning that everybody in the population has a chance at being in the survey, in the sample. And then they extrapolate from, if they take numbers on what they watch, what they did, etc. This is not just for television. The random sample is used for all sorts of sociological research. They'll take a sample and say, what are your ideas here, what did you watch, etc. And then from this sample, if it's truly a random sample, they can reasonably uh, uh, extrapolate what the entire population did based on that sample. When they do surveys for politicals, whatever it might be. Now, there are some places for error. There's something called the margin of error. So if you have 1,000,000 people and you survey 1,000, you can actually get pretty accurate out of 1,000, out of 500. But you have that margin of error. If you remember the polls, it would say statistically they're tied, even though Hillary may have been ahead by 2 points or Trump may have been ahead by 2 points. Statistically, they're tied because of a 3-point margin of error. So that means they could go 3% either way. So they can't really call what the accurate number is. But if it was like Trump at 40 and Hillary at 45, well, that's outside of the margin of error. So they could have said that there was a definite majority or more people were supporting Hillary. So that's what the margin of error is. Let me see. Bias. There are also ways that bias can come into samples. If types of bias, let's say, sometimes people want to say that they watch public television because it makes them look elite, smart, informed. Or they may not say that they watch wrestling. They were watching Masterpiece Theater last night, not the World Federation of Wrestling, because they don't want to be seen as one of those kind of people. Unless you're a NASCAR fan. NASCAR fans don't care. They are NASCAR fans. Kind of like Cowboys fans. But anyway, there is no shame. I didn't like the Cowboys. It's as bad as the Dirty Birds. Yeah, I'm a Saints fan. Okay. Anyway, back to Squirrel. Let's see. DMA and TSA, that's basically the market designations for Nielsen and Arbitron. It's called what's in your DMA, your market. COOM is the cumulative of people listening for radio. Broadcast Ratings Council is just basically makes sure the ratings services are providing accurate, kind of an auditing firm, an oversight council. Hyping and hypoing. Okay, that's basically when people veer from their normal programming and behavior to try to juice up the ratings. During rating sweeps, that's the time when they take the ratings. They have 4 a year. Television may run blockbusters. They may have, um, you know, they may have more sexual content, violent content, more intense content to try to drive the audience up. Radio may have more contests to get people to call in. Make sure you're listening at 5 o'clock tonight. I mean, between 5 and 6 for the secret word. Well, more people listening in, trying to get the secret word so they can win $500, $1,000 in cash. All these things to help push people in the sample into their station. Because what will happen is, for the next 3 months, once those numbers come out, those are the ratings for that station. Whether those are presumed to be the ratings for that station, whether they're accurate or not. Sweeps periods I just mentioned. That's when they actually do the ratings. Set penetration is basically how many people have, in this case it was television, how many television sets, how many homes have television sets. It's like 99.999%. Um, but that was, growing, over the time. Now with um, computers, people aren't watching television as much, per se, broadcast television. So it'd be interesting to see what the new numbers are. Um, Cable penetration, that's the same thing. How many people, there are houses passed with cable, and that's part of what cable will sell to advertisers. We pass so many houses, but the real number is how many people are actually taking cable. For example, cable runs by our house, but we don't take it. So don't count us in your sample. You're not advertising to us. The last term there, focus groups. Sometimes focus groups are they're a subset of the population. I've been part of a focus group, and they'll bring people into a room and they'll show them an ad. Remember, we were looking at ads for a television product. I mean, for a ketchup, and for their television ads. And they would ask us questions. How does this strike you? Did you like this? What did you think? Etc. Just kind of get specific information to see people's attitudes regarding something. It's not just for television. People do focus groups for politicals. They do focus groups for all kinds of products regarding attitudes. When we did research for doing our digital media program, we brought in a focus group of digital media professionals and asked them questions and got their feedback. So those are the terms for operations, which would be, again, we discussed commercial broadcasting, non-commercial broadcasting, audience measurement, and programming. And I'm going to end this here, and then we'll move on next to media research and the FCC and constitutional issues. See you then.